the lockdowns so they can be effective, and the sooner they're more effective and the sooner they are effective, the sooner they end. And of course to continue to roll out the national vaccination program, which today in the most recent data has hit another very significant mark with over 240,000 vaccines delivered in one day. Now that per capita matches and in fact betters the peak of the 7-day average per capita of the UK's vaccination program. So I remarked earlier this week, the national vaccination program here in Australia has certainly turned the corner. Challenges that we have had, we have been overcoming them now for months, and the rates of vaccination that we are now achieving are matching those that were achieved in many countries around the world, and that's what's needed to get this job done. And so today we reflected on those issues. Today we fully agreed the national plan that I outlined to you last Friday. I said it was agreed in principle last week, and that today it was confirmed and fully agreed, the national plan, that pathway that takes us to the position where we live with this virus. And we live with the virus where we ultimately start saying goodbye to lockdowns once we reach 70% vaccination of the population, and then ultimately move away from them in the third phase, phase C. Of course, all public health measures are necessary when you're dealing with a global pandemic. But these important changes, affirmed again today by all the premiers and all the chief ministers, fully agreeing to the national plan that I announced last Friday at the Lodge after our meeting last week. Today we also agreed for further work to be done by the Doherty Institute. We were joined by Professor McVernon from the Doherty Institute with further follow-up work that will be done to support both the states and territories and the Commonwealth as we prepare to move into phase B and phase C of that national plan, further understanding the calibration of public health measures and the impact on how that follows through with the virus and how it may behave. Similarly, looking particularly at further studies into the more vulnerable populations, whether they be Indigenous populations or other vulnerable populations around the country, what the potential impact is, and understanding scenarios that could occur when we eventually start opening up borders and we have additional people coming into the country, and understanding what the scenarios might be in those circumstances. They're not predictive, they're about understanding particular scenarios and how that might play out, and so we can have preconsidered our responses to those issues. We also had a very extensive discussion today on rapid antigen testing, and I'll ask the Chief Medical Officer to speak more to this in his remarks. Might I make it clear that it's not that it's not being used, it actually is being used, but it is an important tool to be used at the right stage of the process. It is being used now in essential workplaces. It is being used now for medical workers and in aged care facilities and things of that nature. It has a very specific purpose at this point. But when you're in the suppression phase, that is phase A of this virus, what is very important is that we need to know who's tested positive. And if you're doing voluntary rapid antigen testing at home and things of that nature, then the state health authorities won't know. And so it's important that we can know and then do contact testing and tracing to ensure that we can follow that through in the suppression phase. While you're in the suppression phase, knowing who has it, knowing who they've been with, and being able to follow that up and isolating close contacts and all of that is a very important part of the public health response to the outbreak. So rapid antigen testing has a very important role to play, there's no doubt about that. And particularly when we get into phase B and phase C, when we're moving from managing cases and moving to managing hospitalisations, serious illness and things of that nature. So there will be further work done preparing for those phases and how rapid antigen testing can be better used in those phases. But for now, it will continue to be used in a very targeted way, and we will continue to work with the Therapeutic Goods Administration to see more of those tests becoming available so they can be used for those purposes. We also heard, and I asked for the Solicitor General to join us today to share his advice on a number of important issues which both Premiers, Chief Ministers and I and our Ministers have been dealing with, and that deals with where employers may be seeking to require employees to have vaccines. Similarly, if a business or an establishment may seek to deny access to a premise or a service in relation to people who are vaccinated or are non-vaccinated. Now, it is not the intention of the Commonwealth nor of the states and territories to create any special laws in these areas. The only area where that has occurred to date has been public health orders around quarantine workers, and also an agreement amongst premiers and chief ministers for those who are moving to put in place those public health orders for aged care workers. But the advice makes clear that there are matters regarding discrimination law and a reasonableness of any direction made to an employee. And that reasonableness goes over 4 tiers, and all of this is explained through the Fair Work advice, which is available on the Fair Work website to assist employers. But ultimately, employers need to consider these matters and make their own decisions, remembering we do not have a mandatory vaccination policy in this country. We do not have that. We are not proposing to have that. That is not changing. But an employer may wish to make a reasonable directive to staff, and if they do so, they would need to do so consistent with the law. And that particularly would deal with a situation where an employee may be in direct contact potentially of becoming infected and acquiring the virus. And so they are workers who are working in quarantine facilities, obviously, which are covered by public health orders. Where there's a public health order, the legal position is very, very clear. But it may include people like airline workers or others in those situations where they are coming in close contact with those who may be carrying the virus. You have a second tier, which are those who may be working with people who are quite vulnerable. And that's why the consideration has been given to groups like aged care workers and others who are coming in close contact with people who are vulnerable. And it may be that a business would take a decision in that respect. A third tier are those who are in a position where they are public-facing in their daily work. So we're talking about retail, supermarkets, things of that nature, working in essential occupations where there's a lot of contact. Now again, these are all legal positions which have to pass that reasonableness test, and they are ultimately decided by the courts. And employers need to obviously consider those matters very carefully if they're looking to make directions of that nature. Now, then you have the balance, who are those who may be public servants or those who are not in often close contact with others in the course of their work. And these basically work on a sliding scale, if you like, in terms of how the reasonableness test might be applied. That is the advice that we're receiving. And I'm sure employers who are considering these things would be also taking their own advice on those matters. The Solicitor General, though, did indicate that when it comes to issues of discrimination, then discrimination would relate to the discrimination laws, and so that would be in relation to discrimination against a person in relation to a disability, for example, or something like that. Now, it would be unlikely that a person being vaccinated or unvaccinated would be related to whether they are of a particular gender or whether they're of a particular disability or of a particular race or something like that. And these are the matters that is indicated to us that would have to be considered in making that judgment. Not having a vaccine is not a disability, but of course if people do have particular medical conditions or issues that might prevent them from being able to be vaccinated, well of course that would be a different issue. So these are not being spoken of by me as any sort of direction, but to convey to you what was conveyed to Premiers and Chief Ministers today in our understanding of this situation and how we are seeking to simply make that information available, but ultimately their choices for the businesses themselves. Then, of course, you have the right to whether people are denying access to property or